habitué? Your little sketches are just art school trash compared to my psychological algorithms, Simon.
Find me before he returns, and I'll marry you. Use that pencil of yours to save my life.
In the sterile, cold halls of the FBI's elite behavioral unit, Simon Hart was a ghost. While others relied on supercomputers and complex data modeling to track the nation's most dangerous predators, Simon relied on the smudge of graphite and the subtle twitch of a witness's lip. He was a man of quiet observation, a craftsman in a world of digital noise, often relegated to the corner of the room while the real experts took the stage. Clara Vance was the antithesis of Simon's quiet world. A media darling and celebrity profiler, she moved with the sharp, predatory grace of someone who believed she had solved the human soul. To her, Simon was an antique, a sentimental relic whose hand-drawn sketches were art school trash that belonged in a museum, not in a modern manhunt. She didn't just disagree with him, she looked through him, dismissing his intuition as mere guesswork. But the darkness has a way of humbling the proud. When a killer known as the Architect decides to turn Clara's algorithms against her, the bright lights of the television cameras fade into the suffocating shadows of an abandoned asylum. Locked away where her data cannot save her, Clara is forced to realize that the only person who can see the monster's face is the man she once treated with utter disdain. The fluorescent lights of the precinct briefing room hummed with a clinical intensity that mirrored Clara Vance's sharp, analytical tone. Simon Hart sat at the back of the room, his fingers stained with the familiar gray smudge of 4B graphite as he refined a sketch of their current suspect. He focused on the subtle asymmetry of the man's jaw, a detail provided by a traumatized witness that felt more vital than any data point. For Simon, a face wasn't just a collection of features. It was a map of a person's history, pain, and intent. He believed that by capturing the soul of a killer on paper, they could find where that soul was hiding in the real world. Clara Vance stood at the front of the room, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum as she gestured toward a massive digital screen. The screen was a chaotic web of heat maps, behavioral nodes, and predictive movement algorithms that she had spent years perfecting. She was the face of the modern FBI, a celebrity profiler who moved through the world with the absolute certainty of a mathematician. To her, the hunt for the Architect was a game of logic and probability, and she had no patience for anything that couldn't be quantified by a processor. Her eyes skipped over the detectives in the room, landing only on those she deemed intellectually worthy of her time. I've narrowed the suspect's primary hunting ground to a 3-block radius in the industrial district, Clara announced, her voice echoing with a rehearsed authority. Simon cleared his throat, holding up his latest sketch, which depicted a man with a slightly drooping left eyelid and a jagged scar near the hairline. The witness was very specific about the way he blinked, Clara, Simon said softly, his voice cutting through her presentation. He has a physical tic that suggests a previous neurological injury, possibly from a specific type of industrial accident. If we look for that injury in medical records instead of just geographic patterns, we might actually find him. Clara didn't even look at the drawing. She simply sighed, a sound of profound boredom that made the other detectives snicker under their breath. She walked over to Simon's desk and picked up the paper with 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. "This is what's wrong with this department, Simon," she said, her voice dripping with a sugary, condescending venom. "You're trying to find a monster with a pencil and feelings. This is art school trash, a subjective interpretation of a panicked mind that has no place in a serious investigation." The room went silent as Clara crumpled the edge of the sketch, her eyes cold and dismissive. Simon felt the heat rise in his neck, not out of ego, but out of a genuine concern for the victim they were failing to find. He had spent hours calming the witness, coaxing out the memory of that specific, haunting blink, knowing it was the key to the killer's identity. "It's not just art, Clara," Simon replied, his voice steady despite the public humiliation. "It's human observation. Algorithms can tell you where he might be, but they can't tell you who he is. You're looking for a ghost in a machine." Clara laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that silenced any further debate. "I am looking for a killer using the most advanced psychological tools on the planet, while you are playing with charcoal," she snapped, tossing the sketch back onto his desk. "Stay in your corner, Simon. Let the professionals handle the heavy lifting before you embarrass yourself further with your sketches." She turned her back on him, returning to her digital maps and leaving Simon to smooth out the creases in his rejected work. The detectives moved closer to her, drawn to the shine of her celebrity and the promise of her technology. As the meeting adjourned, Clara made a point of walking past Simon one last time, leaning in so only he could hear her final jab. "The world has moved on from people like you, Simon. You're a relic of a time when we guessed at the truth instead of calculating it." She didn't wait for a response, stepping out of the room with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Simon watched her go, his thumb tracing the line of the suspect's jaw on the paper, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest that no algorithm could explain. Late that night, the precinct received a chilling video file sent directly to Clara's personal email, bypassing every digital firewall she boasted about. The footage was grainy and silent, showing a high-tech lab being systematically dismantled by a shadowed figure who moved with a strange, hitching gait. At the very end of the clip, the figure turned toward the camera, and for a split second, a drooping left eyelid was visible in the strobe light glare. Before Clara could even process the breach, her phone buzzed with a final text message from an unknown number. "Let's see if your math can predict where I'll take you." The morning air in the precinct was thick with a frantic, suffocating energy that Simon could feel the moment he stepped off the elevator. Clara Vance's desk, usually a pristine command center of tablets and high-end coffee, was a crime scene in itself, surrounded by yellow tape and stone-faced internal affairs officers. Her signature designer blazer was gone, replaced by a half-empty bottle of water and a shattered smartphone that lay on the floor like a broken promise. The very algorithms she championed had failed to flag her own stalker, leaving a void where the department's brightest star used to be. Simon looked at the empty chair, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach as the realization sank in. Clara was gone. The chief of police paced the briefing room, his face a mask of weary desperation as he looked at the monitors that were now displaying nothing but static and dead-end data. Every GPS tracker in Clara's vehicle had been disabled, and her cloud-synced security system had been wiped clean by a sophisticated worm. The architect hadn't just taken her, he had erased the digital breadcrumbs she usually relied on to solve cases, effectively blinding the entire task force. Simon stood at the periphery, watching as tech experts hammered at keyboards, trying to force a logic out of a situation that was inherently chaotic. He knew they were looking for a needle in a haystack of code, ignoring the human element that was staring them in the face. "We have nothing," the chief growled, slamming his fist onto the conference table while staring at the blank heat maps. The killer bypassed every predictive model we had. He moved through the blind spots in our surveillance like he knew exactly where the cameras weren't looking. Simon stepped forward, his sketchbook tucked under his arm like a shield, and placed a single drawing on the table, the one Clara had called art school trash. "He knew where the cameras weren't looking because he helped install them," Simon said, his voice quiet but echoing in the sudden silence of the room. He pointed to the jagged scar he had drawn near the suspect's hairline, a detail the computer vision software had dismissed as a shadow. The room erupted in a chorus of skeptical murmurs, with the lead IT specialist scoffing at Simon's suggestion that a hand-drawn scar could mean more than a terabyte of data. "That's a reach, Hart," the specialist snapped, not looking up from his screen. "We've scanned every facial recognition database in the tri-state area, and that feature didn't trigger a single hit." Simon didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the chief, who looked like a man willing to grasp at any straw. "The software is looking for matches in criminal databases," Simon explained. But this man isn't a career criminal. He's a former contractor for the security firm that built this precinct's infrastructure. Simon flipped to a new page in his sketchbook, showing a series of rough studies he'd made of the hitching gate seen in the taunting video. He had spent the previous night watching the footage on a loop, not looking at the pixels, but at the way the man's weight shifted, suggesting a chronic hip injury. This isn't a digital footprint, it's a physical one, Simon continued, his heart hammering against his ribs. He's hiding in plain sight in places that don't exist on your modern maps, old, decommissioned municipal buildings that were struck from the digital records decades ago. The chief looked from the sketch to the blank monitors, the silence in the room stretching until it became unbearable. Under the weight of environmental pressure and the ticking clock of a kidnapping, the chief finally nodded, signaling for Simon to lead the way to the archives. As Simon dug through dusty paper blueprints of the city's forgotten underground, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on his back, some hopeful, most still deeply cynical. He was operating in a world of ink and parchment, a stark contrast to the high-speed fiber optics that had failed them so spectacularly. Every minute he spent searching through the physical files felt like an hour, and the pressure to be right was a heavy, invisible hand pressing down on his shoulders. He knew that if his intuition was wrong, Clara's life would be the price of his mistake. Far across the city, in the bowels of a rotting asylum that had been erased from the city's master plan in the 90s, Clara Vance woke up in darkness. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and damp concrete, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic dripping of water. She reached out, her fingers brushing against cold, rusted iron bars that vibrated with the low hum of a distant generator. Her mind, usually a sharp instrument of deduction, was a clouded mess of fear and confusion as she tried to calculate her escape. But there were no variables to input, no data to analyze, only the terrifying realization that she was a prisoner in a place her algorithms said didn't exist. A shadow moved in the darkness outside her cell, the sound of a dragging footfall echoing against the tiled walls with a terrifying regularity. Clara pressed her face against the bars, her eyes wide with a primal terror she had only ever studied from a safe distance. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice cracking as the silhouette of a man came into the faint light of a flickering bulb. He didn't answer, but as he turned his head, she saw the drooping eyelid and the jagged scar that Simon had tried to show her in the briefing room. In that moment, the cold logic of her world shattered, replaced by the haunting realization that the relic she had mocked was the only person who truly saw her captor. The abandoned asylum breathed with a stale, rhythmic coldness that seemed to mock Clara's internal attempts at logic. She sat on the floor of the soundproof cell, her expensive silk blouse ruined by the grime of the concrete, feeling the walls close in on her. For years, she had lectured about the criminal mind as if it were a slide under a microscope. But now she was the one being observed. The silence was absolute, a sensory deprivation that made her own heartbeat sound like a drum, drowning out the analytical voice she had spent her life cultivating. She realized with a jolt of panic that she couldn't think her way out of this. There were no patterns to exploit when the architect of her prison was a man who lived outside the digital world. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted from frantic energy to a grim, heavy despair as the second day of the disappearance began. The smart search grids had come up empty, and the political pressure from the mayor's office was mounting, demanding results that the technology couldn't provide. Simon sat in a corner of the darkened evidence room, surrounded by old photographs of the city's forgotten industrial rooms, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He wasn't looking for a location anymore. He was looking for a person's why, sketching the suspect's face over and over until the lines felt like they were vibrating. He was trying to find the emotional resonance between the killer's physical trauma and the places he would choose to hide. "You're wasting time with those drawings, Hart," a detective muttered as he walked past, his voice weary and devoid of its earlier bite. Simon didn't look up, his charcoal pencil scratching aggressively against the grain of the heavy paper. The algorithm missed the scar because it was looking for a person, not a story, Simon replied, his voice raspy. This man was an apprentice at the Blackwood Asylum before it was shut down. His father died in a boiler explosion there that the city covered up. He held up a sketch of the asylum's boiler room, drawn from a blurry 1970s archive photo, but infused with a menacing modern detail. Inside her cell, Clara's composure finally broke as the killer appeared at the small viewing slit in the door, holding a tray of food she refused to touch. He didn't speak, but his presence was a heavy weight, his drooping eyelid giving him a perpetually mournful look that Clara found more terrifying than anger. She tried to use her profiling techniques, attempting to build a rapport by mentioning his presumed trauma, but he merely tilted his head like an inquisitive bird. "Your data is wrong," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that chilled her to the bone. "I'm not a statistic. I'm the part of the world you forgot to draw." As the killer walked away, his hitching step echoing, Clara collapsed against the door, the cold iron biting into her shoulder. She thought of the briefing room, of the way she had looked at Simon's sketch and seen only a crude representation of a face she deemed irrelevant. She had called it trash, yet that trash was the only thing that had accurately captured the very man currently holding her life in his hands. A wave of profound shame washed over her, more painful than the fear, as she realized her brilliance was a hollow shell. She had built her career on being right, but she had never been more wrong about a person than she was about Simon Hart. Simon's intuition finally clicked when he noticed a recurring symbol in the killer's old architectural blueprints, a stylized eye that matched the shape of the scar on the suspect's forehead. It wasn't just a scar, it was a brand, a mark of the architect that the man had claimed for himself as a twisted form of identity. Simon realized the killer wasn't hiding, he was building a masterpiece, and Clara was the final, living piece of his installation. He grabbed his tactical gear and his sketchbook, bypassing the chain of command that was still arguing over server logs and packet data. He knew where they were, not because a satellite told him, but because he finally understood the killer's need to be seen. The environment of the precinct seemed to fade away as Simon drove toward the outskirts of the city, the urban sprawl giving way to the skeletal remains of the industrial district. The pressure was no longer social or professional. It was purely visceral, a race against a clock that was measured in breaths rather than seconds. He checked his sidearm, but his hand lingered on the worn leather of his sketchbook, the tools of his trade feeling more like weapons than ever before. He was heading into a ghost world, a place where the rules of the modern age were suspended, and only the primal truth of a pencil and paper remained. Clara, hearing a distant metallic clang from somewhere high above her cell, looked up at the ceiling with a flicker of desperate hope. She imagined the SWAT teams, the helicopters, and the high-tech drones she always advocated for, but deep down she knew they wouldn't find this place in time. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't pray for a miracle of science or a breakthrough in data. She prayed for a man with a pencil to see through the darkness she had created for herself. The silence of the asylum returned, heavier than before, as she waited for the sound of a footfall that wasn't a hitching, dragging limp. The iron gate of the Blackwood Asylum groaned as Simon pushed it open, the sound echoing through the desolate courtyard like a dying breath. He didn't have the backup he'd requested. The departmental bureaucracy was still debating the validity of his artistic leads, while he was already on the ground. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the crumbling facade, but Simon moved with a strange, calm certainty, his senses tuned to the environment in a way a sensor never could be. He could feel the weight of the history here, the pain and the abandonment that the architect had woven into his identity. Every step Simon took was a quiet dialogue between his intuition and the physical reality of the rotting structure, leading him deeper into the heart of the monster's lair. Inside the basement, The air grew thick with the smell of old paper and damp earth. The silence broken only by the low mechanical thrum of a localized power grid. Simon found the control room, but instead of high-tech servers, he found walls covered in charcoal drawings, crude, violent sketches that mirrored his own suspect portraits, but reflected a fractured soul. He realized then that the killer didn't just hate Clara, he was obsessed with the idea of being seen, and Clara's algorithms had rendered him invisible. Simon's own sketches were the only thing that had acknowledged the killer's existence, making this a confrontation between two men who understood the power of a face. He moved toward the sound of a distant, muffled sob, his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached the heavy steel door of the soundproof cell. Clara looked up through the small barred window, her eyes bloodshot and wide with a mixture of disbelief and raw, primal relief when she saw Simon's face. She looked like a ghost of her former self, the arrogance stripped away to reveal a vulnerable woman who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. "Simon?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that barely carried through the thick metal. "You found me. The math, the malls, they said this place didn't exist." Simon pressed his hand against the cold iron of the door, his eyes scanning the lock mechanism, realizing it was an old mechanical deadbolt that required a physical key he didn't have. A heavy, dragging footfall sounded from the darkness behind Simon, and he turned to see the architect emerging from the shadows, a jagged scalpel glinting in the dim light. The man's drooping eyelid gave him a look of eternal sorrow, and the scar on his forehead pulsed with a dark intensity that no digital scan could ever capture. "You," the killer rasped, ignoring Clara and focusing entirely on Simon. "You're the one who drew me. You're the only one who didn't look at a screen to find me." Simon stood his ground, his hand moving slowly toward his belt, but not for his gun. He gripped his sketchbook, realizing the killer viewed this as a sacred exchange of recognition. The killer moved closer, the scalpel held low, his gaze fixed on the charcoal-smudged fingers of the man who had captured his likeness so accurately. "She thinks I'm a number," the architect hissed, gesturing toward Clara's cell with a flick of the blade. "But you saw the accident. You saw the mark my father left." Simon realized that the killer didn't want to die. He wanted his story to be finished, to be rendered in a way that would last forever. In a moment of desperate, calculated sacrifice, Simon stepped away from the door and toward the killer, opening his sketchbook to a blank page. "I can finish the portrait," Simon said, his voice steady despite the proximity of the blade. "But she has to go. A masterpiece needs a witness, not a prisoner." Clara watched from behind the bars, her breath hitching as she realized what Simon was doing. He was offering himself as a psychological and physical substitute to buy her freedom. The social pressure of the precinct, the insults she had hurled, and the professional distance she had maintained vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of debt. She reached through the bars, her fingers brushing Simon's shoulder as he stepped into the killer's reach. "Simon, no, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking. But Simon's focus was absolute. He was using his art school trash to negotiate for a life, turning his perceived weakness into a singular, heroic strength. The killer paused, the tip of the scalpel inches from Simon's throat, his eyes darting between the sketch and the man who drew it. He seemed mesmerized by the prospect of being truly documented, of having his pain validated by the only person he deemed worthy of the task. "You would trade your life for hers?" the architect asked, a twisted sense of curiosity flickering in his dark eyes. In the suffocating tension of the basement, Clara pressed her face against the bars, her tears finally falling freely as she whispered the words that would change both of their lives forever. "Find me before he returns, and I'll marry you," she gasped, her voice thick with a desperate, burgeoning love. Use that pencil of yours to save my life, Simon. Please. The killer let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound of a man who had already won, and reached for the heavy iron key hanging from his belt. As the lock turned and the door creaked open, Simon felt the cold edge of the blade press against his neck, a silent promise that his sacrifice was only just beginning. The heavy steel door swung open with a mournful groan, and Clara stumbled out of the darkness, her legs nearly giving way as she collapsed into the damp hallway. Simon didn't move, his body acting as a human shield between the fleeing woman and the architect, whose scalpel remained pressed firmly against the pulse in Simon's neck. "Run, Clara. Don't look back," Simon commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl of authority that she had never heard before. For the first time, Clara didn't question an order or analyze the data. She felt the raw, sacrificial love behind his words, and realized that his intuition was a force more powerful than any logic she possessed. She scrambled toward the stairs, her heart breaking as she heard the scratching of Simon's pencil resume against the paper, even as the killer tightened his grip. In the flickering shadows of the basement, Simon worked with a feverish, transcendent focus, his hand moving across the sketchbook page with the precision of a surgeon. He wasn't just drawing a face, he was documenting the killer's internal collapse, capturing the moment the architect's hollow victory turned into a desperate need for validation. Every line Simon drew was a calculated delay, a rhythmic stalling tactic that echoed through the silent asylum, masking the distant, muffled sound of tactical boots approaching from above. The killer was entranced, his eyes fixed on the paper where his own jagged scar and drooping eyelid were being elevated into a haunting work of art. Simon felt the cold steel of the blade nick his skin, but he didn't flinch, knowing that his dignity and his life were now inextricably linked to the truth of the portrait. Outside, the silence of the industrial district was shattered by the sudden, synchronized arrival of blacked-out SWAT vans, led by a frantic Clara who pointed toward the basement entrance. She had reached the perimeter just as the first units arrived, her designer clothes tattered and her celebrity facade completely dissolved. "He's in there! He stayed behind to save me!" she screamed at the commanding officer, her voice raw with a protective fury that stunned the hardened tactical team. She wasn't the distant profiler anymore. She was a woman fighting for the man who had seen her soul when she was too blind to see his. The team moved in with surgical speed, guided not by digital coordinates, but by the physical map Clara had memorized from Simon's sketches. Back in the cell block, the architect suddenly stiffened, the primal instinct of a hunted animal overriding his obsession with the drawing. He looked from Simon's calm, steady eyes to the finished portrait, seeing a man in the drawing who looked more pathetic and broken than he had ever dared to admit to himself. "You didn't draw a monster," the killer hissed, his hand trembling as the sound of the breach echoed through the vents. "You drew a failure." Simon looked him directly in the eye, his voice devoid of fear. "I drew the truth," Simon replied, "and the truth is that you're finished." Before the killer could strike, the flashbangs detonated, filling the room with a blinding white light and the overwhelming thunder of justice. The tactical team swarmed the room, a sea of black gear and red laser sights that pinned the architect to the wall before he could draw another breath. Simon was pulled back by strong arms, his sketchbook falling to the floor, open to the final, devastatingly accurate portrait that had saved Clara's life, its technician with the reverence of a holy relic. The detectives who had mocked Simon now looked away, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had done with a pencil what they couldn't do with an entire department of technology. The atmosphere of the asylum shifted from a tomb to a place of liberation, the weight of the darkness finally lifting. Clara pushed through the line of officers, ignoring the clear commands, and threw herself into Simon's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. She gripped his tactical vest, burying her face in his neck, her tears hot against his skin, as she felt the steady, heroic beat of his heart. "You came for me," she sobbed, her voice a jagged whisper of gratitude and realization. "You saw what I couldn't. You saw everything." Simon held her close, his charcoal-stained fingers stroking her hair. The silence between them filled with a profound understanding that transcended their professional worlds. The woman who once lived for the spotlight and the applause of millions now found her entire world in the quiet strength of a man who worked in shadows. Months later, the frantic noise of the FBI headquarters felt like a distant memory to the woman sitting on the porch of a quiet house on the edge of the city. Clara Vance had officially retired from the public eye, her name fading from the headlines as she systematically dismantled the celebrity persona she no longer recognized. She looked down at her hand, where a modest ring caught the light, a symbol of a promise made in the darkest hour of her life. Inside the house, she could hear the soft scratching of a pencil against paper, a sound that now brought her more peace than any dataset ever could. She had traded the cold certainty of algorithms for the beautiful, unpredictable truth of a man who saw the world through the lens of the heart. As the sun began to set, Simon stepped out onto the porch, a new sketchbook tucked under his arm, and a look of quiet contentment on his face. He sat beside his wife, and for a moment they simply watched the world move by, a couple defined not by their professions, but by the sacrifice that had forged their bond. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as she listened to the rhythm of his breathing, the ultimate proof of his triumph. The architect was behind bars, the algorithms had been recalibrated, but the only thing that mattered was the man who had used a simple pencil to draw them a future. In the quiet of the evening, the artist and his muse finally found the one thing that could never be calculated, a love that was truly, perfectly seen.